Okay, so in this video, we're going to do a brief overview of World War One. So the idea here is that we're going to talk about some of the long-term causes of why World War One broke out, and we'll start into the early phases of the war, highlighted by the trench warfare and the stalemate that the war will inevitably turn into once it gets started. So the idea here is not to go into a lot of detail, but to kind of look at World War One very, very broadly. So if we think about the long-term causes, I've always used the acronym MANIA to describe the long-term causes of World War One. And so we'll talk about some of these very, very briefly, and we'll go into more detail with some of them. But just to go in order, the M stands for militarism. And generally speaking, what we're seeing in Europe up until the start of the 20th century is the glorification and growth of militaries. And we see this kind of in two very different ways. We kind of see this in a cultural way through a kind of militaristic patriarchy. The idea that war turns boys into men. And given that the 19th century has women raising boys, one of the things that was highlighted for young men was to join the military. Joining the military was good for you. Going to war was good for you. It's what turns you into a man. The other side of this is the economic or industrial side. And this is just the industrialization of weapons. We have so many guns and bombs, and later on tanks and planes, that it's inevitable that they'll be used. So this idea that war is good for you, and the idea that we have so many weapons and we need to use them, is one of the long-term causes of World War One. The next letter is the alliances, and we're going to come back to the alliances, so we'll wait on the alliances. The next one is nationalism. And this one is really, really easy to understand. The idea here is that nations prove that they are better than other nations Through war. Like, that is the simplest way to prove that one nation is better than another nation. And if we want to think about this as being a long-term cause, you could make a convincing argument that French nationalism, going all the way back to the French Revolution, sparked all the other nationalisms that compete in World War I. So if we want to think about this going back to like Napoleon, you could make a pretty convincing argument that starting with Napoleon, that was the first seed of World War I. The I in mania stands for imperialism. And as we've already seen through a few smaller conflicts, imperialism was a vehicle for nationalism. These two ideas go together. So one way you could prove that you have a very big and powerful nation was to have a big and powerful empire. Empire and nationalism go together. And we've already seen a few examples of imperial powers going to war with each other or almost going to war with each other. So we could think about maybe the Fashoda crisis, the Russo-Japanese War, the French invasion of Mexico, where they're coming up against the United States. These were all possible sparks of a larger war that just didn't happen. We could have easily seen a conflict between France and Great Britain. We did see a conflict between Russia and Japan that, thankfully, for the time being, was limited to Russia and Japan. And the French wisely backed out of Mexico when the United States finished with their Civil War. All of these could have turned into larger conflicts, but didn't. And we were just waiting for the spark to actually light the powder keg. The last A is the assassination. This is the actual spark that lights the war off. The assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So this happens in June of 1914. Now, the alliance and the assassinations go together. So we're going to talk about the alliances and the assassination together because the assassination triggers all of the alliances. So here's how the assassination triggers all of the alliances. So if you remember, when we were talking about German unification, the new German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, didn't renew his alliance with Russia. Which drove the Russians to form an alliance with France, who was also being targeted by the Germans. So the Russians and the French form an alliance. The British more or less remained neutral, but sided with France mostly because they were democratic like they were, and could act as a check on the Germans. And remember, for the British, the most important principle is always maintaining the status quo. So helping the French check the Germans helps balance the powers. Okay, so what we get out of this is what's called the Triple Entente. An entente is a fancy word for a kind of a neutrality treaty. They all agreed not to fight each other if a war broke out. Now, also included in here, we might throw in Japan. We might also throw in here Serbia. You might also throw in here Greece. They're all more minor powers, but they're also kind of included in this too. Now, the other side of the alliance, or the other alliance in this, are the Central Powers. And not to confuse you, but this is known as the Triple Alliance. So you've got the Triple Entente, which is Russia, France, and Great Britain. And then you've got the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Now, it's easy to see why Germany and Austria-Hungary are together because they're both German. Germany and Austria-Hungary are aligned because they're German. Italy joins with them because they see Germany as a kind of kindred nationalist spirit, and their best ally in getting more territory. Now, we might also throw in here Bulgaria, because Bulgaria was the biggest loser in all of those conflicts in the Balkans. And we might also throw in here the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire opposes Russian expansion. And remember, the Russians have always kind of been circling the Ottomans like vultures. Pretty much for the last 100 years. And so the Ottomans don't like the Russians because the Russians have been pushing them around. And we can even go back to like the Crimean War and know that the Russians and the Ottomans are not at all friends. In fact, the only time that the Russians and the Ottomans ever were on the same side is when they were both fighting Napoleon. Okay, so here are the general alliances. And here's how the war gets started. So right after the Serbian nationalists and the actual assassin, Gavrilo Princip, or Princip, they assassinate Franz Ferdinand, with the idea being, if Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, it will unite all the Serbians across the Balkans, because there are Serbians that are not in Serbia. There are Serbians in Austria-Hungary. There are also Serbians in the Ottoman Empire, and these Serbian nationalists want all of the Serbians to be together. This would be seen as a uniting incident. So when that happens, Austria-Hungary gives Serbia a set of more or less unmeetable demands. And this happened in July of 1914. And this period of time, July into August of 1914, is known as the July Crisis. Because everybody can kind of see that we're lurching towards a war. We don't want to, but there's really nothing we can do about it. So Austria-Hungary gives Serbia a set of unmeetable demands. We don't really need to go into what they are, but the idea is that Serbia can't meet them. Austria-Hungary knows two things. It knows that Serbia can't meet these demands. And it also knows that Russia backs Serbia, and without question. Why does Austria-Hungary think that it can get away with this? Because Germany has given Austria-Hungary their unconditional support. This is known as the German blank check. So Austria-Hungary goes into this knowing that they could probably push Russia around, but they also know that they've got Germany backing them up. When Serbia can't meet these demands, That happens on July the 30th, 1914. Austria-Hungary declares war. And that triggers all of the alliances. Oh, I'm sorry, that happens on the 28th, July 28th, 1914. 2 days later, Russia mobilizes for war. And when Russia mobilized for war, 2 days later, on August the 1st, 1914, Germany declares war on pretty much everybody that matters. They declare war on Russia, but they also declare war on France, and they also declare war on Belgium. Declaring war on Belgium is the reason that Great Britain gets into the war. So 3 days after that, the United Kingdom declares war on Germany, pretty much for invading Belgium. Why did Germany declare war on Belgium? Because that was how they were going to get into France. This was their entry point to France. That's why they declared war on Belgium. Now, that's how the war starts. It was this slow, inevitable progression of events that drew everybody into the war. The German plan, which we kind of see play out here at the very beginning of the war, the German plan is called the Schlieffen Plan, named after their Minister of War, who we don't really need to bother with. But the Schlieffen Plan basically said they would attack France first and knock them out quickly, and then attack Russia. That was the plan. Germany was in a bad position because they had enemies on either side. Now, what ended up happening was this, but the plan was based on the idea that the Russians would be really slow to get moving. So the Russians mobilized a lot faster than Germany realized, or than Germany prepared for. Which means they couldn't send as many troops as they wanted to France. And the French defenses held. So what we end up with between 1914 and 1917 is a two-front war. The Western Front, because we're looking at this from the German perspective, the Western Front, which was with Germany and France. This turns into a stalemate. And we'll come back to that in a second. The Eastern Front this is with Germany and Russia. This turns into a pretty significant German victory. And that is going to lead to the Russian revolutions. But we'll worry about that in an upcoming video. Now, our attention right now is going to stay here on the Western Front. The Western Front was a stalemate, meaning no side could win. There were these giant battles that resulted in one side maybe winning 5 miles of territory. The Western Front was a stalemate. No one could win. And so what we see here is this awful trench warfare, where soldiers are basically living in giant holes in the ground, trying to fight the soldiers maybe about a mile away in their hole in the ground. And this trench warfare is marked by significant uses of new technologies. Now, some of these new technologies were to kind of prolong the stalemate. So things like barbed wire. So barbed wire was placed between the trenches. So, like, if these are the trenches, it would be placed between them to keep enemy soldiers out. Now, the barbed wire was used, it was invented as a means to help ranchers to keep cows or horses or whatever from knocking down fences. But here it was used to slow down troops as they tried to run across what was called no man's land in between the trenches. The other technologies, new technologies, were invented or, I guess, changed or altered to break the stalemate. So things like poison gas. You would lob canisters of poison gas into the other trench to get them to come out of the trench so you could shoot them. Now, this didn't work so good because poison gas doesn't really work outside. So all you need is a nice gust of wind and the poison gas will go away, but it was definitely used. Airplanes were used to bomb enemy trenches, but airplanes were so new, they weren't effective yet. So basically, you've got pilots dropping hand grenades from above, which is scary, but not really scary enough to stopped the trench warfare. The thing that actually stopped the trench warfare was the invention of the tank. The tanks actually broke the stalemate, because what the tanks can do is they can drive through all this barbed wire and get to the other side with nothing stopping it. So the invention of the tanks around 1916 is really what broke the stalemate on the Western Front. Now, the war itself isn't really that interesting, because this is what it was. It was just this stalemate on the Western Front and this German victory on the Eastern Front. There's not a whole lot going on. What we're going to do over the next few videos, however, is look at some really important incidents that happened during the war that really don't have anything to do with what's going on in Europe, but are being carried out by Europeans outside of Europe. So in our next video, we'll look at some incidents that are happening outside of Europe. How does the war actually become a world war? So we'll talk about the expansion of the war and how the war was fought in places like East Asia and Africa. So that will be in our next video. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.